Unlike some other types of programs, a web servlet is not designed to endure forever. Instead, it has a clearly defined life cycle wherein it is initialized, modified, run, and removed. The primary controller for this life cycle is the container in which it has been deployed, either the web context or the session. When a request is first mapped to the servlet, its container will load the servlet class, create an instance of it, and initialize that instance. Then it will invoke the service method of the servlet and pass it a request and response object. Similarly, when the servlet is complete, the container will call its destroy method and remove the servlet. The initialization and destruction of a servlet are handled by its javax.servlet.servletContextListener implementation. So let's start with that. Go under Java Resources, Source, and then right-click on the servlet package and create a new Java class. I'll call it Web Context. In order to be a context, this class must implement Servlet Context Listener, so I'll add that to the class description. As usual, we have to import the relevant Java class. Now notice that the name of the class has a red line under it, telling us that it needs to implement some methods in order to be considered a proper implementation of the Servlet Context Listener class. This is a great way to figure out which methods to implement in your context, so go ahead and choose Add Unimplemented Methods. The two events that we must handle in this context are the initialization and destruction of the context. Before we implement these methods, though, we should have a local copy of the context. That will allow the initialization and destruction to reference the same context rather than recreating it each time. I'll add the line private servlet context equals null. And as usual, I have to import the relevant method. Now, under each auto-generated method, we can add the line context equals arg0.getServletContext. And I'll just copy and paste this since it's going to be the same line both times. Once those lines have been added, the rest of the code is really just standard Java code and will depend on your implementation of the servlet. There are a few context-specific methods that might be useful to know. The get, set, and remove attribute methods are all used to modify the attributes of the context. This is essentially just a mapping from the attribute names to their functions, but it's an easy way to store data in your context. It's also good practice to record every change you make in the log by using context.log. This method simply records simple descriptions of the changes you make, which will be invaluable for debugging later on. Finally, you can actually create and add servlets from within the web context using the createServlet and addServlet methods, allowing you to associate more than one servlet with a single web context. What we've gone through here is an example of just one of the many types of listener classes available for a servlet web context. This particular one happens to be listening for the creation or destruction of the context, but you could just as easily define a javax.servlet.servletContextAttribute which listens for an attribute to be added, modified, or removed. You might also have the listeners for the HTTP session, like javax.servlet.http.http_session_listener, which checks for events in the lifecycle of the HTTP session. Regardless of which listener type you employ, though, the basic methods are the same. For each relevant event, you can insert code that will apply some action based off of that event.